now that we've been sufficiently
unfortunately, it's not all good. I'm sorry to say.
All. Like, and that's just. I mean, it happens. Like the bad stuff, even though it's there, it's not always terrible. But then there are some times when it's real bad. Specifically, I think the first time to maybe, or first thing to point on, is when it gets in the way of your plot. I know I was watching Asterisk War, and I was like, this is a beautiful show. It's going to be really cool. And geez, were there so many butt and boob shots. Like everywhere. Like you couldn't go 2 minutes without one. And I think the one thing I hate the most is when you see a bunch of talking breasts. Like forever. It's just like, please, like, stop.
It's dehumanizing.
It's dehumanizing. It just doesn't take its characters seriously, and it doesn't make sense. It's like, breasts don't talk.
The part that bothers me most about that is when I was in high school, I knew guys who would not talk to me unless I was wearing a low-cut shirt, and it felt terrible. And so when I see that in anime, that just reminds me of that experience of feeling like my personhood does not matter to him. He only cares what I have to say when he can get something out of it. And I think that's the biggest. That's the most hurtful part of that kind of fan service to me is when,
So we're talking about, at this point, a general dehumanizing aspect.
Right, and I mean, like, especially when, I think to the point is that when fan service does get in the way of your story, like when you obviously have a really cool thing to tell.
Yeah.
Like there's this amazing world they're trying to build up or like this cool, interesting plot. And then you're just like, well, we're just going to fill it with fan service and call it a day.
Yeah, I couldn't finish the episode because it really was every boob and butt shot. I was like, well, what is supposed to really be happening here? Like, I really wanted to know because the description sounded cool.
Yeah, it's like, well, this is so cool, but you're just littering it too much. It's like there is a thing as too much. Yeah. And some people are cool with that. Like that's totally fine if that's the show you want, but it just feels bad whenever like you have such a cool thing and like sure throw on some fan service, but don't make that your primary objective when like it's just you're ruining the cool show apart.
Fan service it shouldn't be a detour. Like it just it feels like we threw this in just because it's like, oh, really? Like, you couldn't have even worked in a bathhouse scene? Like, there's nothing you could have done. Like,
or even if you do, you feel like the story is suffering for it. I'll go back to The Devil is a Part-Timer, which was, what I was watching for the week. And, you've got this great premise, and it's just like, they're like, well, we paid the writer enough. So there's this girl and this girl and this girl, and we'll find ways for all of them to be angry and in swimsuits. And we'll throw in a little shirtless devil here every now and then, and some people yelling Dragon Ball style and throwing things, and repeat, rinse, repeat. And I don't quite get that. Maybe some of it's the manga origin of a lot of this stuff, and manga, again, some of it, frankly, is designed to be titillating. It's there for several reasons, and one of them is because it's fun to look at pictures of scantily clad people when you're alone in your room. And maybe some of that translates over to pausing the stream at some point. But I really do think that this actually does go a little deeper, and we're finished talking about the points here. The dehumanizing aspect of it, I think that it actually has a lot to do with things that are happening in Japan right now, and that's why we're seeing more and more and more of it as time passes. But I don't know. Are we to that yet? Or?
I mean, yeah, it's because there's a couple of things we talked about earlier, like the maturity aspect. It seems like a lot of guys are tripping and accidentally falling on girls' boobs and squeezing them. And as someone who's been sexually harassed by that, I don't just, and then get over it like a lot of these girls do. It rattles me real bad. It's really, really violating. And I feel like the joke comes at the girl's expense a lot. And it's been bothering me lately because it's been in like 2 different anime this season.
Right, like even if it's an ecchi or whatever, like it doesn't excuse glamorizing assault. Like, and that's something we kind of have to realize, like, sure, this isn't like something we're creating or anything, and we can't really do much about it, but it's just sad to see that's like such a big trope. Like the full falling part isn't the bad part. The part is when they get that extra squeeze.
You get the extra
It's
squeeze.
like, I'm here and now,
harassment.
That's assault.
That's assault. That's beyond harassment. That's assault.
That
is.
The punchline should not be assault.
Like accidents happen. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Make it funny. That
like,
totally works sometimes.
The squeeze is laughing at assault, and that's
that's the thing.
I think this also happens in the reverse. My biggest example would be Shimonetta, which I had to stop watching because Anna is like just assaulting the main character, and it's disgusting, and I couldn't handle it, and it was played off like a joke a lot of the time, and was really grossed out by it. It was like, haha, she just discovered what being horny is, and now she's just gonna chase him and like force herself on him. And I'm like, first of all, normal people who are discovering their sexuality don't do that, number one.
Anime.
Yeah, like, even if you just discover that you are attracted to somebody, you don't, like, just push them down and pin them on the ground and just be like, I love you. That's not, I mean, like, that was just, I know the show's supposed to be over the top and everything, but that was too far.
Well, over the top, in principle sounds fine, but over the top, when you start talking about sexual mores, you got to be real careful, because I think about, okay, in America in the 40s, we had Pepe Le Pew running around chasing that cat. Remember that?
Yes.
Okay, now those are animals. And nonetheless, this is the skunk. He chases the cat. He pins the cat in a corner. The cat goes limp, and he's just like kissing all over the cat, who obviously does not want to be there, runs away. It repeats and goes on. That's kind of creepy.
It's
really creepy when you're talking about a skunk and a cat. Now, you carry that over to a bunch of high school students, and one of them is willingly fondling another person. That's not something that it's not good, man. It's not good.
That's not fan service. It's just,
that's
like we said,
just
glorified assault.
Yeah. And I think that's objectification. That's turning a character into an object. And yes, I understand all fictional characters are not real people. I get that. But part of what makes fiction work is our willingness to accept that in our own heads they are. When you start accepting those rules, you start fiddling with the rules, because it's, you're going to end up in some very difficult places very quickly, places you probably shouldn't. And we see a lot of that.
Yeah.
A lot of this comes down to dehumanization, I guess.
Yeah.
Just different kinds of disrespecting your characters, and disrespecting. I think it's disrespectful to laugh at sexual assaults to real victims. I think it's really tasteless.
Yeah.
So that just bothers me so much.
But I do notice in our notes that, Jared, you have a wonderful dissertation on the why, which I really because having lived in Japan as well, I think you bring up some interesting points.
Right.
Yeah, I can't prove this. This is all anecdotal. But Japan's changing a lot. It is economically and socially changing. Change happens there at a different pace than it happens here, in different ways, because there's certain things you talk about in public and certain things you talk about in private. But when I was living there, we talked with our students a lot. And, my wife had one of her students told her, this was a woman in her mid-50s. And she said, when I was growing up, I watched American sitcoms. And I watched the way that my parents treated each other, and my parents' friends treated each other, and the boys treated me at school. And then I watched TV and how these people from overseas lived, at least in this fictionalized world. And she said, they got a way better deal than I did. And as she grew up, she became a professional woman, and she dated, and she met guys that were not particularly interested, because at that time the cultural expectation in Japan was, frankly, male-centered. A woman was expected to quit her job. She could have a career, but she quits her job when she gets married. She has babies. He provides. She follows orders. She has dinner ready. She rubs his feet when he gets home. And she's sexually reticent, outward, and sexually willing whenever he wants it, and that's that.
I mean, like, to that point, like, one of my Japanese professors got pregnant while we were in college, and she was teaching us, and she had to take some time off. And she told us how her mother, she's like, yeah, my mother's, really liberal, and she's, more progressive than a lot of people. But whenever I was getting ready to have my baby, my mom asked, are you going to quit your job now? Because you're, that's just the mentality. You just stop. You go home and take care of the family. And, it's just... I mean, I guess for other societies, like, whoa, you guys still do that? It's something you have to recognize that culturally there are big differences.
But now it's changing, and so this lady said, I decided not to get married, so she became a career woman, and she, and she doesn't have a long-term relationship that she's been in the way she'd like to, but she vacations all over the world, and she's fiercely protective of her identity. And she said, there's more and more of us. And when I talk to my other students, I hear a lot of the same thing. Women saying, look, my opinion matters, and I'm sick and tired of men telling me what my life's going to be like. And it's taken a long time because overt movements are very rare there, but it is happening. It's also been hastened, I believe, by the economic changes in Japan.
Yes, that very much is a part of it.
Two-income houses are now necessary in a lot of places, and with economic power, comes social power and social liberty.
Yes.
And women have honestly gained more rights on their economic strength. And they're starting to say women are choosing, they don't need a husband to make a living. And they can demand more. The problem, and this is where I think this rolls around into fan service for young Japanese men who are the target, as we've talked about several times for these films, is that they don't talk about this openly very much in Japan. If I give you an anecdote here. Riding a little train in the small town I'd live in, when the high schoolers would get on the train, a big cluster of high school boys would get on one end of the car, and a big cluster of high school girls would get on the other end of the car. And they'd all kind of look at each other and giggle and talk. But you never actually saw them together, with the exception of sanctioned events or at the very, very most personal and secret and intimate moments. Other than that, there wasn't a lot of contact. I walked around a corner of a shrine in the back of the little town once and walked around, and I saw a high school boy leaning over and kissing a girl on the lips that was sitting on a swing set.
Aww.
And the two of them, there was
so
nobody
sweet.
around. They just had the sweetest little kiss and sat back, and I was just like, I just turned around and I was like, I have
You don't wanna
just
be that
interrupted
person.
somebody's
Yeah.
wonderful kiss. But that said, that's very personal, and so people aren't talking about these changes openly. So what guys are having, they're in a world where they're surrounded by images of, frankly, what we call misogyny and sexual assault and these kinds of things, and the idea that men should get what they want because they provide and and they go out with their bosses once they get their jobs, and their bosses say, yeah, you got a wife at home, but tonight after we go out drinking and talk about work, we're going to go to the brothel, and that's part of life. And then they meet women who are not willing to play along with what they've been told life should be like. And their response sometimes, I think, is anger, confusion, frustration, because they do not understand the social changes happening around them. Now, I'm not trying to be an apologist for these kinds of attitudes, but I do think, being surrounded by that culture, that there wasn't enough said about the changes that were happening. They were just happening and nobody was talking about it. I believe, and I could be wrong, that a lot of the more assault-oriented, violent fan service appearing in this objectification is probably a market, I hate to say that, but somebody smart sitting there making these things. Oh, I can respond to that. Here's this, guys like this. And I'm hopeful that the changes we're seeing, as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, that the equal representation we're beginning to see as female fan service begins to make its way into these things, might be the first step in gradually rolling these attitudes over. I can't make excuses for it, but I can say that I think I have a smidgen of an understanding as to maybe why this is happening. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think it's interesting that with men and women in Japan, especially at a young age, I mean, we talked about the klutzy, I found the girl and squeezed her boob. Like, we talked about the falling isn't the problem, but the squeezing thing almost sends the message of the only way you can get a girl is to do these kind of stealthy, pervy things without her permission kind of thing. And
Sneaky things.
Yeah, these sneaky things. And it's just like, that worries me a little bit, because it's like, well, if you show them a better way to do that, you wouldn't be, quite as frustrated and everything. It's very tied into the culture, I know, but it does worry me that we seem to see a lot of that lately, where it's like, you can't just have the boy and girl dynamic. It's got to be some weird, awkward thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate having your perspective on Japan, Jarrett, because I think one of the trickiest things about critiquing anime is keeping in mind the cultural differences.
Right.
Because you don't want to unfairly project, American standards or Western standards onto a completely different culture. But
you can't excuse it either.
You can't excuse.
It's a weird balance of like, I understand.
It makes critiquing anime very difficult,
right?
And like a very tricky balance. Like one of the things also is there is little to no genderqueer or agender or non-binary representation in anime, which is a relatively new, not new thing here, but like something that's people are becoming more aware of in the States. So I don't expect that from anime. I'm not going to fault anime for not including that, because it's like Japan is, like we said, Japan is lagging with.
They've barely moved past new half as comedy.
Sure, exactly. Not even yet. They're still, using, transness or gender experimentation as comedy.
Sure, and to that point, like diversity and race too.
Right.
Like Japan is made up of Japanese people. It's like 90 something, 90.
It's very
80%. It's hard to expect like Hispanic or Black or like anything else aside from Japanese characters in your stories.
So, but I think it's still fair for us to say, things like sexual assault make us really uncomfortable. This is really gross, and we don't have to tolerate it. Like we're allowed to point out that this is not how it should be. I think assault is one of those things that I am I have a very strong opinion on. I'm very intolerant of it in any context. So, even with the difficulties in examining anime just with different cultural lenses, I think that's one of the things with fan service that I can definitively say, like, stop doing that, quit that. But then there's other things like we talked about, just weird things that might be cultural things. Like I think it's on the notes, brother sister complexes.
Yeah, there's a lot of sister
Yeah.
complexes in the past year.
Even in like Sailor Moon, which is weird because like you see Rainy like head over heels over Darien and whichever translation of their names you want.
Yeah.
And like that's her dad, and she knows that.
Yeah, she becomes cognizant of it after Sailor Moon R, or Sailor Moon Crystal episode 20, whatever. But
sometimes with anime, like there's things where I'm like, if this wasn't anime, I'd be really upset by this. But because it's anime, I'm just kind of roll with it.
Well,
because I just don't know how to examine it.
Let's run with that for a second. I mean, what you just said there, we're talking about fan service, which is a very different thing from pornography, but the common theme of objectification does run between those to a point. And we're talking about another culture and some of the strangeness for us, the ethical constraints, the social situations, the economic things. But, if we point the lens at ourselves and talk about the degree of objectification in, say, something like American pornography now and what's happening there, there are, the lens turns around and it's maybe reflecting some things we're not talking about as well. So
definitely.
it does help and that helps, I think, to remember that in the end, we talk about these different cultures, but it's all people.
Yeah.
And when we sit, go talk to some Japanese people about anime, and you guys are going to be able to have a discussion with your new friend about these issues and get their perspectives, and you're going to be able to learn more. And I think that's good. We're all people.
Which is why I think assault is one of those things that I'm so universally against, because we are all people, right?
Yeah.
I think a better example than the brother-sister complex is just age of consent is lower in Japan.
Right.
So that's probably a much better example, actually, is just, watching an anime about high schoolers and having fan service. That's something where I'm like,
it's just so
there's a line
weird.
there with the 16-year-olds, but it's not a problem there, but it is here. And that's the kind of thing where I'm just gonna let
or
this
like
be.
Makura no Danshi, where it's like Pillow Boy. I'm like, I don't like that.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to
okay.
forget sometimes too, because forget that they're high schoolers. Like with Free, it's like these guys are like super objectified sometimes, and like they're in high school.
They're
but
in high school.
Like we like it, but also it's just like it's weird.
Yeah, it's like a weird, blurry age of consent thing that because Japan has a different standard than the U.S., that's the kind of thing where I'm like, I'm not going to even really bring this up in the critique of the fan service, either positive or negative, because
it's just
like we talk about Food Wars, like all of those, most of the people who are naked in that show are high schoolers, but there's just there's something there that I don't know.
Still love it, but it's just,
I have to just roll with it because of the difference.
Right.
So
it's like just part of like accepting that there is a difference, and obviously we're not going to go out and just like.
You're not going to roll up to a high school and be
kids.
like, hey, guys.
No.
Yeah, also, I think anime high schoolers are way more mature than real high
schoolers. Some of them, at least.
Some of them. I'll be watching anime, and I'll be like, I don't remember being that smart or good at anything. Like, that's probably not fair to myself, but
Satsuki.
But, like, I see Satsuki, and I'm like, Satsuki's so flawless. How did she get there so quickly? And so, that's just one of the things where, like, age is not something I particularly pay attention to in anime.
And to be fair, Japanese culture is very youth orientated. So
so
and
there
storytelling too.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of big differences we have to recognize when critiquing fan service.
Right.
And that's sometimes, when we bring up with other episodes, like, oh, we don't like the show because like there's certain parts of fan service. Like this is, if you ever had questions, this is where it all comes from.
Yeah.
So, hopefully, like we'll see more of the stuff we said we liked, and it'll just shift a little bit. Of course, the stuff that we dislike will always be there. Like it'll always be somewhere. There's always the Twilight. But and it's fine.
It's fair if people like those things too.
Like they can exist and they can be a part of things, and we don't have to partake in that, and that's totally fine. it's just recognizing when things are bad. And like you can still like bad things. Like I like Twilight. Surprise! I like Twilight, guys. I read it and I loved it. I was in high school. I was a freshman, and I was super happy about it.
I'm gonna you and Angie together.
It's like you can like something and recognize what it's doing wrong.
It's okay. I've
Like,
watched more Real Housewives than I would like to admit.
So it's not like we're condemning people who like it.
Yeah.
Unless you're okay with assaulting people, that's terrible.
That's really the one different.
That's a story.
I want to be fair, but like that's the one thing where I'm like, literally stop doing that. It's gross.
You're allowed. I think we can be too hard on ourselves. You're allowed to have ethical boundaries that you're just not comfortable with. You know, you don't need to apologize. We always want to strive to be more open-minded people, especially across cultures, and to learn and to be challenged. But once we've challenged ourselves and been challenged and keep trying to learn, we're still allowed to say, nope, I just don't like this. It's okay. It's all right not to want people to sexually assault others in front of you. That's just fine.
Or ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.